A warrior lies dying on a frozen field. The battle has moved on without him. Steel rings somewhere in the distance. Breath turns pale in the air. His hand still clutches the weapon that could not save him. But in the old Norse imagination, this moment was not simply an ending. Death could be a summons. For some of the fallen, the last sight was not darkness, but a choosing, a passage, a hall beyond the sword, where Odin waited. And that hall had a name, Valhalla. But what was Valhalla, really? A warrior's paradise? A military camp for the dead? Or something colder, stranger, and far more unsettling? To understand that question, we have to slow the scene down, not rush toward the feast, or the shining helmets, or the thunder of heroic music that later ages would attach to the myth. We have to begin with the body on the field, because Valhalla only makes sense from that edge, the place where fear, violence, honor, and belief meet. The old stories do not give us a modern heaven. They give us a hall, a god, a selection, and a promise that glory may not mean peace. So tonight, we step carefully into that promise. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe, so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. And as we begin, leave a comment letting us know where in the world you are watching from tonight. It's a reminder of how far these forgotten echoes can reach. Valhalla is one of the most famous images in Norse mythology, but fame can make a myth less clear, not more. Over time, it has been painted, sung, nationalized, commercialized, and turned into a kind of fantasy afterlife for anyone with a sword and a dramatic enough death scene. The older idea is sharper than that, more selective, more uncomfortable, because Valhalla was not merely a reward. It was a gathering place for the dead who still had work to do. And somewhere between the battlefield and Odin's high seat, the question begins to change. Not just who was worthy of entering Valhalla, but why Odin wanted them there at all. Chapter 2, The Chosen Slain. Valhalla was never meant for everyone. That is one of the first things the modern imagination tends to smooth over. We hear the name, and it begins to sound like a general Norse heaven, a northern paradise with drinking horns, long tables, and warriors laughing beneath a roof of shields. But the older picture is narrower than that, harder, more conditional. To reach Valhalla, a person did not simply need to be brave. They did not merely need to live well or worship correctly or belong to the Norse world. The defining threshold was death in battle, and even that was not enough by itself. The fallen had to be chosen. In the myths, that choosing belonged to Odin and to the Valkyries, those strange and commanding figures who move along the edge of combat like a living verdict. They were not just escorts, they were selectors. In some traditions, they decided who would fall. In others, they gathered those already marked by death and carried them toward Odin's hall. Either way, entry into Valhalla depended on more than human effort. A warrior could train, boast, raid, swear oaths, and die with a weapon in hand. And still, the final decision belonged elsewhere. That detail changes the mood of the myth. Valhalla was not a simple prize that courage automatically purchased. It was a fate granted from above, or perhaps seized by divine design. The warrior's life moved toward glory, but glory itself remained uncertain. There is something deeply revealing in that. A society may praise courage, but a myth like this admits that death is never fully under human control. The battlefield may look like a place of strength, yet the final authority belongs to unseen powers. This is where Valhalla becomes more than a fantasy of heroic reward. It becomes a way of thinking about the terror of battle. For a warrior culture, death in combat could be socially meaningful, even admired. Songs could preserve a name. Kin could remember bravery. A lord could reward loyalty while the warrior lived. But none of that erased the private fear of the moment itself. The instant when the body fails, when the field becomes confusion, when no reputation can stop the blade. The idea of being chosen offered a different kind of meaning. It suggested that a violent death was not random. It was not waste. It could be interpreted as recognition. The fallen warrior was not merely lost. He had been noticed. And yet, that comfort carried a colder implication. If the gods chose some, then they did not choose others. The Norse afterlife, as far as the surviving sources allow us to see it, was not one clean map with one destination. Valhalla was one possibility among others. It belonged especially to the battle-slain gathered for Odin. That means it was selective by design, not accidentally exclusive. The myth did not promise that all the dead would rise into a glorious hall. It imagined a sorting. And sorting always creates anxiety. Who was worthy? Who had died the right kind of death? Who had been seen by the right divine eyes? What about the old, the sick, the drowned, the murdered, the farmer, the child, the woman who held a household together while the men chased reputation across the sea? The old sources do not answer every question neatly, and we should be cautious about forcing them into a modern system. Norse belief was not a single official doctrine written in one book and repeated unchanged across Scandinavia. It varied by place, period, family, and storyteller. Still, the Valhalla tradition gives us a strong impression of what mattered to a particular heroic imagination. A good death was not peaceful. It was public. It was witnessed. It was dangerous. It happened in the zone where a person's courage could be tested and remembered. That does not mean every Norse person longed for such an ending. It means that elite warrior culture had a language for making such an ending beautiful. This is often where the romance begins, and where we should be most careful. It is easy, from a safe distance, to admire the image of the battle-slain warrior rising toward a golden hall. It is harder to remember what the myth is transforming. Mud, panic, torn banners, broken shields, a man who may have wanted glory in the morning and life by sunset. Valhalla gives that death shape. It takes the unbearable fact of the body and places it inside a larger story. That is the power of the chosen slain. They are not just dead warriors. They are deaths made meaningful. But the meaning is not gentle. It does not say, "Your suffering is over." It says, "You have been selected." It does not lead to rest beside a quiet river. It leads to Odin. And Odin is not a god who gathers warriors simply because he enjoys their company. He has his own reasons. Chapter 3. Odin, father of the fallen. Odin is often introduced as a king of the gods. That is true enough, but it can also make him sound too stable, too noble, too easy to understand. Odin is not simply a northern Zeus sitting above the clouds with a crown of authority and a predictable sense of justice. In the surviving Norse myths, he is stranger than that, hungrier than that. He is a god of war, but not only war. A god of wisdom, but not gentle wisdom. A god of poetry, magic, death, kingship, prophecy, and dangerous knowledge. He gives gifts, but his gifts often come with a hook hidden inside them. He seeks truth, but the truth he seeks is rarely comforting. He is the one-eyed god, the wanderer, the questioner, the planner. He does not merely rule the story. He studies it, interferes with it, and tries, again and again, to bend it toward his own purpose. That matters because Valhalla is his hall. Not every afterlife realm in the Norse imagination belongs to Odin. Not every dead person is drawn into his orbit. But the warriors of Valhalla are gathered under his authority, and that tells us something important about the kind of afterlife this is. It is not a peaceful garden maintained by a merciful father. It is a war hall kept by a god who knows the future is coming for him. The name often given to the chosen dead is the Einherjar, the fallen warriors who dwell in Odin's hall. In modern retellings, they can look almost like honored guests at an eternal victory banquet. But when we place them beside Odin himself, the image darkens slightly. Guests are invited for pleasure. Soldiers are assembled for use. Odin is not collecting the dead at random. He is preparing. The myths point toward a future catastrophe. Ragnarök, the doom of the gods. The old order will break. Monsters and gods will meet in a final conflict. Even Odin, with all his wisdom, does not escape that ending. This is one of the most unsettling features of Norse myth. Divine knowledge does not guarantee divine safety. The gods may know the shape of disaster and still be unable to prevent it. So Odin gathers warriors. Here, his wisdom and his warlike nature become almost inseparable. He does not seek knowledge as an abstract virtue. He seeks it because knowledge is power, and power may buy time against fate. He does not gather the slain because death has made him sentimental. He gathers them because the dead can still serve. There is a cold intelligence in that. And yet, it would be too simple to turn Odin into a villain. Norse myth rarely gives us that kind of clean moral arrangement. Odin can be inspiring, terrifying, generous, deceitful, noble, ruthless, all in the same divine figure. He is the patron of rulers and poets, but also of outlaws and those who practice uncanny forms of magic. He stands close to civilization, but never entirely inside its walls. He is a god of the hall and the battlefield, but also of the road at night, the disguise, the hidden question. That complexity helps explain why Valhalla feels so difficult to classify. If Valhalla were ruled by a purely benevolent god, we might call it paradise. If it were ruled by a purely monstrous one, we might call it a trap. But Odin is neither simple comfort nor simple cruelty. He is a god who understands value in dangerous things. Sacrifice, reputation, ecstasy, terror, memory, bloodshed, and song. To be chosen by Odin, then, was not necessarily to be saved in the modern sense. It was to be claimed. That distinction is small, but it changes everything. Salvation suggests release. Claiming suggests ownership, obligation, and purpose. The fallen warrior does not pass beyond the problems of the world. He enters more deeply into the designs of a god. This may be why Odin remains such a compelling figure. He reflects a world in which wisdom does not always make a person kind, and power does not always make a person secure. He is not above fear. In some ways, he is shaped by it. His endless pursuit of knowledge is driven by the awareness that something terrible waits ahead. He knows enough to see the edge of the cliff, but not enough to move the mountain. So he prepares the only way a war god can. He builds a hall. He fills it with the dead. He turns defeat into recruitment. And if we listen closely, that makes Valhalla feel less like an escape from the battlefield than an extension of it. The warrior dies beneath the sky, but Odin's interest in him does not end there. The weapon falls from the living hand, only to be taken up again in another realm, under another command. This is the darker dignity of Odin, father of the fallen. He gives meaning to violent death, but that meaning is not softness. He offers honor, but not rest. He opens the doors of a great hall, but the hall belongs to a god who is counting his forces. And before any warrior reaches those doors, before the feast, before the fighting, before the echo of shields beneath the roof, there is another presence on the field. Not Odin himself, his choosers. Chapter 4. The Valkyries at the edge of battle. Before a warrior could enter Odin's hall, someone had to decide that he belonged there. That decision gives the Valkyries their power. In modern imagination, they often appear as shining riders in the sky, noble, armored, almost angelic, descending through clouds with spears and streaming hair. There is grandeur in that image, and some of it has roots in older tradition. But the Valkyries of Norse myth are not simply beautiful escorts for heroic men. Their name points to something more severe. They are connected to choosing the slain. That is not a gentle office. To choose the slain is to stand at the border between courage and extinction. It is to look across the and mark one life rather than another. It is to make death feel personal, even intentional. In a world where battle could become chaos in an instant, the Valkyries gave that chaos a shape. The spear that struck, the shield that failed, the sudden turn of luck. These could be imagined not as accidents, but as the movement of fate through divine hands. This is why they are so unsettling. They do not merely arrive after the violence is over, like mourners collecting the honored dead. In some accounts and poetic images, they are present within the violence itself. They influence it. They hover at its edge, not safely outside the human world, but intimately involved in the moment when a warrior's story ends. The battlefield becomes a place where human skill and supernatural selection overlap. That overlap is important. A warrior might believe in strength, training, courage, and loyalty. He might trust his sword, his lord, his companions. But the figure of the Valkyrie suggests that even the strongest man was never the only author of his fate. Someone else might already be watching. There is a strange comfort in that, and a strange horror. The comfort is obvious. A chosen death is easier to bear, at least in story, than a meaningless one. To be carried from the field by a divine figure transforms defeat into recognition. The fallen warrior is not abandoned in the mud. He is claimed for a higher hall. His last breath becomes the first step in another kind of service. But the horror is quieter. If the Valkyries choose who dies, then their beauty does not soften their role. It sharpens it. They are not simply symbols of reward. They are agents of loss. To see one may not mean salvation is near. It may mean your life has already been measured. This double nature is what later retellings often flatten. They keep the splendor and remove the dread. They keep the winged or mounted woman, the dramatic music, the noble ascent. But in the older imagination, a Valkyrie belongs to the battlefield before she belongs to the banquet hall. Her presence is tied to bloodshed, judgment, and the terrible intimacy of divine attention. And yet, again, the evidence is not a single clean portrait. The surviving sources preserve different kinds of Valkyrie figures. Some appear close to supernatural battle spirits. Some are named and individualized. Some are connected to heroic legend, where they may love, defy, advise, or suffer. Over time, poetry and storytelling gave them human features, emotional lives, and tragic dimensions. They could be terrifying choosers of death, but they could also become characters caught between obedience and desire. That variety matters because it reminds us not to treat Norse myth as a rigid system. Myth is not a government form with every office clearly defined. It is a living language of images, retold across generations. The Valkyries could carry different meanings depending on the poem, the region, the audience, and the purpose of the story being told. Still, one core idea remains powerful. The battlefield was not spiritually empty. For the people who told these stories, war was not merely a contest of bodies. It was also a place where fate revealed itself. The Valkyries made that invisible pressure visible. They gave a face to the moment when a warrior's luck ran out, or when his death became valuable to Odin. There is something almost bureaucratic in the phrase, chosen slain, though the myth itself is anything but bureaucratic. It suggests a grim selection process, a divine sorting carried out amid shouting, metal, and fear. Not every fallen warrior is just dead. Some are taken, some are redirected. Some are entered into Odin's gathering of forces. The Valkyries are the motion between those worlds. They are the last figures of the battlefield and the first figures of Valhalla. They belong to the instant when a human life becomes mythic property. And perhaps that is why they have survived so vividly in the imagination. They carry both sides of the promise, the beauty of being chosen and the terror of what choosing costs. Picture the battlefield again, but not from the ground now. From above, the lines have broken. Men call names that disappear into the wind. A shield turns underfoot. A raven circles low. Somewhere, a warrior falls and does not rise. To his companions, it may look like misfortune, or courage, or the ordinary cruelty of war. But in the mythic eye, something else has happened. A selection has been made, and once that choice is complete, the story leaves the field behind. The dead are not taken into silence. They are carried toward a hall so vast that even its roof seems to speak the language of war. Chapter 5. Inside the Great Hall. Valhalla is usually imagined from the inside. Long tables, roaring fires, drinking horns lifted high, warriors laughing with the kind of confidence only the dead can afford. Above them, shields gleam like pieces of a captured sun. Spears line the walls. Somewhere at the center of it all sits Odin, watching, listening, measuring. It is a powerful image. It is also an image that has been heavily decorated over time. The older sources do give us a grand hall. They place it in Asgard, among the divine dwellings, and connect it unmistakably with Odin. They speak of a place built for the slain, marked by warlike signs, where the chosen dead gather under the authority of the god who claimed them. But many of the details that now feel obvious, the exact look of the benches, the mood of the lighting, the polished cinematic atmosphere, owe as much to later art and modern fantasy as to the surviving medieval texts. That does not make the image false. It makes it layered. Valhalla has always been part place, part symbol. A hall mattered deeply in the social imagination of the Norse world. It was not just a building with a roof and walls. It was where power became visible. A chieftain or king displayed generosity there. Alliances were strengthened there. Feasts were held. Gifts were given. Stories were performed. Reputations were shaped. In a world where loyalty had to be maintained face to face, the hall was a political instrument as much as a home. So when the myths imagine Odin's afterlife as a hall, that choice is not accidental. Valhalla is not a cloud realm. It is not a vague shining beyond. It is a magnified version of elite warrior society. Everything that mattered in the human hall is enlarged into divine scale. The Lord at the center, the honored fighters around him, the food, the drink, the weapons, the shared memory of battle. The dead do not enter an unfamiliar paradise. They enter the most prestigious social world they already understood, only raised beyond ordinary limits. That may be why the myth was so persuasive. A warrior did not have to imagine peace in order to desire Valhalla. He had to imagine status. He had to imagine being welcomed into the greatest hall of all, not as a beggar before a god, but as one of the chosen company. In that sense, Valhalla speaks the language of ambition as much as devotion. But the hall also reveals something more unsettling. Its beauty is built from instruments of violence. Weapons are not stored away as relics of a finished life. They remain part of the architecture, the decoration, the atmosphere. Even abundance is framed by war. This is not a place where the sword is finally laid down and forgotten. It is a place where the sword still belongs close at hand. That difference matters. Many afterlife visions offer compensation for earthly suffering. Rest after labor, reunion after grief, peace after conflict. Valhalla offers continuity. The things that defined the warrior in life define him still. His body may have died, but his social role survives. His appetite survives. His need for honor survives. His usefulness to a lord survives. Only now, the Lord is Odin. The hall's grandeur can distract us from this arrangement. A great roof, great feasts, great company. These are rewards, certainly, but they are also conditions. Valhalla honors the warrior by refusing to transform him into anything else. It preserves him at the very point of his identity. Armed, hungry, competitive, loyal, ready. There is a kind of mercy in that, and a kind of confinement. Imagine walking into such a hall for the first time, not as a visitor, but as someone newly dead. The cold field is gone. The final wound no longer commands the body. Noise rises around you, not the broken noise of battle, but the controlled thunder of a lord's household at its height. The smell of meat, smoke, ale or mead, sweat, leather, iron. The faces of other men who have crossed the same threshold. Some may be legendary, some may be strangers. All have been chosen, and at the far end, Odin. That is the detail that keeps the scene from becoming merely festive. The hall is not self-governing. It has a master. Its order is his order. Its purpose is his purpose. Even the joy within it exists under the gaze of a god who is preparing for a war he cannot ultimately avoid. This is where careful storytelling has to resist two temptations. The first is to make Valhalla too literal, as though we could draw a floor plan and confidently label every beam, bench, and doorway. The second is to make it too symbolic, as though the people who told these stories did not imagine it with real force. Myths live in the tension between those two things. They are not architectural surveys, but they are not empty metaphors either. They shape how people understand the world by giving invisible hopes and fears a visible form. Valhalla's form is a hall. That tells us what kind of hope it offered. Not escape from the warrior world, but entrance into its highest expression. Not solitude, but company. Not moral purification, but recognition. Not silence, but song, appetite, weaponry, hierarchy, and reputation. Still, under all that noise, there is a question. If this is a reward, why does it look so much like preparation? The answer begins with what the warriors do there. Because the chosen dead are not simply seated in splendor, drinking through eternity, while the living envy them from below. Their days have a rhythm, a brutal one. Each morning, the hall empties. The warriors go out. Weapons are lifted again, and Valhalla becomes a battlefield. Chapter 6. The Daily War of the Einherjar. Valhalla's great surprise is not the feast. It is the morning. Because when the chosen dead wake beneath Odin's roof, they do not spend eternity reclining in comfort, polishing old stories until they shine. They do not settle into peace. They arm themselves. The warriors of Valhalla, the Einherjar, are remembered as fighters who go out each day and battle one another. They strike, fall, wound, and are wounded. Then, by evening, they rise again and return to the hall, restored for the feast. The cycle is strange when heard plainly. Combat, death, renewal, celebration. Then combat again. At first glance, it sounds like the perfect warrior fantasy. No final loss, no permanent injury, no widow left behind, no farm neglected, no lord disappointed, no old age stealing strength from the arm. Battle becomes pure performance, stripped of its human cost. Every day offers the thrill of danger without the consequence that makes danger real. But that is exactly where the idea becomes unsettling. A battle without lasting death is not the same as peace. It is violence made eternal. The Einherjar are not released from the thing that killed them. They are returned to it, again and again, as if the afterlife has preserved the most intense moment of their lives and made it into a daily discipline. Their reward is to continue being what they were, warriors whose meaning is proven through combat. This is not accidental. Valhalla is not designed as a retirement hall for the heroic dead. It is a training ground. The chosen warriors sharpen themselves, test themselves, and remain ready. Their endless fighting is not random entertainment. It belongs to Odin's larger purpose, even before that purpose is fully named. The hall is gathering strength. The dead are being kept in fighting condition. There is a grim practicality to it. A warrior who rests forever might become honored memory. A warrior who fights every day remains useful. That distinction cuts through much of the romance surrounding Valhalla. Modern audiences often inherit the myth through fantasy images, heroic music, glowing halls, triumphant arrivals. But the daily life of the Einherjar asks us to imagine something less comfortable. What does it mean for a paradise to require constant rehearsal for war? What kind of heaven is built around readiness rather than healing? The answer depends partly on what one believes a warrior wants. In the heroic culture reflected by the myths, glory was not separate from risk. Honor was not an inner feeling quietly carried in the heart. It had to be displayed, witnessed, tested, and remembered. A warrior's value could be confirmed by action. In that world, endless combat may not have sounded like punishment. It may have sounded like eternal relevance. To be old, forgotten, powerless, and unneeded could be a darker fate than to fight forever among the best of the dead. Still, we should be careful. Myths are not opinion polls. We cannot simply say that every Norse warrior desired this, or that every person in the Viking Age imagined the afterlife in the same terms. The surviving sources are selective, shaped by poetry, memory, elite ideals, and later written tradition. They show us a powerful vision, not a census of belief. But that vision reveals an ideal. The Einherjar do not win their place by becoming peaceful souls. They win it by remaining combatants. They are not purified of violence. They are perfected within it. Their wounds vanish, but their purpose does not. Their bodies are restored so they can be broken again. Their courage is honored by being endlessly demanded. There is an almost ritual quality to the pattern. Morning battle, evening feast. Destruction followed by restoration. Hunger answered by abundance. Violence contained inside a divine schedule. The chaos of the battlefield is transformed into routine. And perhaps that was part of the myth's appeal. Real war is messy, uncertain, humiliating, and often senseless. Valhalla makes war orderly. It gives it rhythm. It makes every fall temporary and every return guaranteed. But even an orderly cycle can become a cage. Imagine the first day as an Einherji. Perhaps there is pride in it. You stand among warriors whose names carry weight. You feel the old strength in your hands. You hear the call, take up your weapon, and enter battle without the fear that once clenched around the ribs. The body remembers what to do. The arm rises. The shield catches. The world narrows into movement and impact. Then the day ends. You rise. You feast. The hall roars around you. And then the next morning, it begins again. At some point, the reward and the duty become difficult to separate. That ambiguity is the heart of Valhalla. It offers the warrior exactly what the warrior culture claims to value: courage, conflict, comradeship, recognition, abundance, the favor of a great lord. But by giving these things forever, the myth also exposes their cost. A life organized around battle may find its perfect afterlife only in more battle. There is no soft field here, no final laying down of weapons, no promise that the self will be healed by becoming something gentler. Valhalla does not ask the warrior to change. It asks him to continue. And perhaps that is why the image has lasted. It is both seductive and severe. It flatters the dream of courage while refusing to hide the machinery behind it. The dead are honored, yes. They are fed, welcomed, and remembered. But they are also drilled by eternity. The battlefield that killed them has not disappeared. It has become immortal. When evening comes, the violence pauses. The warriors return beneath Odin's roof, their bodies whole again, their appetites restored. The benches fill, the noise rises. The reward appears in its most generous form: meat, drink, warmth, companionship, the glow of status after the test of arms. But even the feast has its own secret. It is not simply pleasure. It is the other half of the same warlike dream. Chapter 7. The Feast That Never Ends. After the fighting, Valhalla changes its face. The field gives way to the hall. The clash of weapons becomes the heavier music of benches, voices, drinking horns, and bodies returning from violence with impossible strength. The warriors who had spent the day cutting one another down now gather together as companions. The wounds are gone. The hunger remains. This is the part of Valhalla that has done the most work in the popular imagination. The feast. It is easy to understand why. The image is generous, immediate, almost physical. Meat that does not run out. Drink that keeps flowing. A great company of warriors with nothing ordinary left to fear. In a world where food could be seasonal, status carefully guarded, and survival never guaranteed, endless abundance was not a small fantasy. It was power made edible. But the feast in Valhalla is not just a meal, it is a social order. In the living world of Norse elites, the hall was where loyalty was fed. A generous lord did not merely possess wealth, he circulated it. He gave rings, weapons, food, drink, and honor. Warriors, in return, gave service, courage, and public loyalty. The feast was never only about appetite. It was a ceremony of belonging. To sit in the hall was to know your place in a hierarchy, to be seen, rewarded, and bound to the man at the center. Valhalla magnifies that arrangement until it becomes cosmic. Odin is the lord. The Einherjar are the warband. The hall is the ultimate seat of recognition. The food and drink are not private pleasures. They are signs that these dead have been accepted into the highest company imaginable. They are not wandering ghosts. They are retained men in a divine household. That detail makes the feast more interesting than a simple reward. It is comfort, yes. It is also command. The warriors eat under Odin's roof. They drink in his hall. Their abundance comes from the same God who gathers them for a future war. The feast renews them, but it also keeps them inside the system that requires renewal. In life, a warrior ate at his lord's table and owed him service. In Valhalla, that relationship survives death. This is one reason the myth feels so deeply rooted in human culture. It does not imagine the afterlife as a place where social realities vanish. It carries them across the threshold. Rank, loyalty, display, generosity, competition, and reputation all continue. The dead do not become equal souls floating in peace. They become the honored dead of a warrior hall. There is something almost brutally honest about that. Many cultures imagine paradise by enlarging what the living already desire. Gardens for people who know thirst. Cities of gold for people who know poverty. Reunion for people who know grief. Valhalla offers what a certain warrior elite could recognize as the good life. Food, drink, comrades, weapons, status, and the approval of a powerful lord. The myth does not ask a fighter to dream of becoming a farmer of clouds. It gives him the perfect hall. And yet, like everything in Valhalla, the generosity has an edge. The feast comes after combat. It does not replace combat. It rewards the day's violence and prepares the body for the next one. The table and the battlefield are not opposites here. They are partners. One empties the body. The other restores it. One proves courage. The other celebrates it. Together they create a cycle that can look joyful from one angle and exhausting from another. This is where the modern fantasy version tends to become too clean. It gives us the drinking and the laughter, but forgets that the feast is not freedom. It is scheduled relief, a pause in the machinery. The warriors are not eating because all struggle is finished. They are eating because the struggle continues tomorrow. Still, we should not drain the feast of its warmth. For the people who shaped these stories, the hall was not merely oppressive. It was the place where isolation ended. To be outside the hall was dangerous. To be inside was to belong. After the loneliness of death, after the cold field and the broken shield, Valhalla offers company. That matters. A warrior does not rise into silence. He rises into recognition. There would be names there, stories, boasts, old rivalries made harmless by resurrection, or perhaps not entirely harmless. There would be laughter sharpened by pride, memory polished into performance, and the strange ease of men who have already crossed the line everyone else fears. If the daily battle is Valhalla's discipline, the nightly feast is its emotional seduction. It says, "You are not lost." It says, "Your courage has brought you to the table." It says, "The Lord of the Dead has room for you." And because myths are often wiser than they first appear, it may also say something quieter. The dream of endless glory depends on endless repetition. The same food, the same drink, the same combat, the same return. Abundance becomes eternal, but so does the need for it. The feast never ends because the war never ends. That is the hidden symmetry of Valhalla. By day, the Einherjar rehearse death. By night, they rehearse honor. Neither half is complete without the other. A warrior culture cannot live on violence alone. It must explain why the violence matters. The feast provides that explanation in social form. It turns injury into status, survival into celebration, and obedience into belonging. Under Odin's roof, the dead are fed not simply because they are loved, but because they are needed. And perhaps that is what makes the feast so haunting. It is beautiful in its way. Warm, loud, abundant, human. It gives shape to one of the oldest hopes, that after suffering someone will welcome us, that after fear there will be a place at the table. But in Valhalla, the table is set inside a war camp. The drinking horn is raised beneath the shadow of Ragnarök, even before anyone speaks its name. The laughter is real. The honor is real. The plenty is real. But none of it cancels the deeper purpose of the hall. It only makes that purpose easier to accept. Chapter 8. Paradise or Prison. The easiest way to misunderstand Valhalla is to call it heaven and leave the word unexamined. Heaven, for many modern listeners, suggests rest, release, a place where pain has been answered and the soul is finally free from the machinery of fear. Even when different religions imagine it differently, the word carries a softness. It suggests arrival after struggle. Valhalla does not fit comfortably inside that idea. It gives the dead glory, but not escape. It gives them abundance, but not stillness. It gives them brotherhood, but only among those who have been chosen for violence. It heals their wounds, but only so they can receive new ones. It is bright with reward and dark with repetition. That contradiction is not a flaw in the myth. It is the myth. Valhalla is paradise only if paradise means becoming forever what your culture most admired. For a warrior shaped by the values of courage, loyalty, reputation, and public honor, Odin's hall offers an astonishing prize. No slow decline, no shameful obscurity, no fading from memory. Instead, the dead warrior remains strong, recognized, fed, armed, and surrounded by others who understand the same code. But if paradise means freedom from violence, Valhalla begins to look like something else. Not quite a prison in the modern sense. The sources do not describe the Einherjar as pleading to leave or cursing their fate. That would be our invention, and we should not force it onto the myth. Yet the pattern itself feels enclosed. The warriors are held inside a cycle whose purpose belongs to Odin. They fight, feast, recover, and repeat. Their afterlife is meaningful, but meaning is not the same as freedom. This is where the story becomes psychologically interesting. Valhalla takes the most dangerous part of warrior identity and turns it into an eternal reward. It says that battle is not merely something endured for honor in life. It is the very environment in which honor continues after death. That is a powerful idea because it removes the contradiction between wanting glory and fearing the cost of glory. In Valhalla, the cost is transformed. Death becomes temporary. Wounds become passing inconveniences. The battlefield becomes a proving ground without final loss. And yet, the myth cannot quite erase what it is built from. It still needs bloodless bloodshed, harmless harm, death without ending. The very fantasy reveals the trauma it is trying to master. Real battle takes people away. Valhalla brings them back. Real wounds ruin bodies. Valhalla restores them. Real death silences the warrior. Valhalla gives him a louder hall. The promise is beautiful, because the reality was terrible. This may be why Valhalla remains so compelling. It does not deny violence. It domesticates it. It brings war indoors, places it under a roof, gives it a timetable, surrounds it with food and song, and makes it serve a cosmic purpose. What was chaotic becomes organized. What was frightening becomes honorable. What was final becomes rehearsal. That is not a small transformation. For the living, such a myth could work like armor for the imagination. It could make the possibility of death easier to face. It could tell a warrior that the worst moment of his life might also be the moment he was seen by the gods. It could tell a community that the fallen had not vanished into nothing. They had gone to a greater hall, under a greater lord, for a greater battle still to come. But myths that comfort often also reveal what a culture cannot solve. Valhalla does not end war. It perfects war. It does not heal the warrior by removing him from the conditions that shaped him. It preserves those conditions at divine scale. If the living hall demanded loyalty, the dead hall demands it still. If the living battlefield made reputation, the dead battlefield continues the work. The afterlife becomes a mirror, and what it reflects is not only courage, but dependence on conflict for meaning. That is why paradise or prison may be the wrong choice. Valhalla is both less simple and more disturbing. It is a reward that functions like preparation, It is an honor that also binds. It is a feast hall with the logic of a barracks. It is not punishment, but it is not peace. It is not hell, but neither is it the end of suffering in the way a modern audience might expect. The myth asks us to imagine a world where the highest reward is not comfort, but usefulness. That is a hard idea to sit with. In many modern fantasies, the hero earns the right to lay down the sword. In Valhalla, the sword remains central. The warrior's worth is not completed by death. It is transferred. His identity is not dissolved into calm. It is sharpened for service. Even after the final breath, he is still part of a command structure. And Odin's command structure has a destination. This is the key that unlocks the darker meaning of the hall. The daily battles, the endless feasts, the restored bodies, the gathered dead. None of it exists only for pleasure. The hall is waiting. The warriors are waiting. Odin is waiting. Valhalla is not simply where the chosen slain are rewarded for the past. It is where they are prepared for the future. And in Norse myth, the future is not an age of eternal victory. It is not the slow expansion of divine peace across the worlds. It is a breaking point. A reckoning. A day when gods, monsters, and all the forces held back by order move toward collision. So the question changes again. Not whether Valhalla is beautiful, it is. Not whether it is honorable. Within its own world, yes. The deeper question is why a god would need such a hall at all. Why gather the bravest dead? Why keep them armed? Why feed them beyond measure? Why drill them in combat day after day? Because Odin is not building heaven. He is storing an army. Chapter 9. The Shadow of Ragnarök. Odin's hall makes full sense only when we look toward the end. Not the end of one warrior. Not the end of one battle. The larger ending. The one that hangs over the Norse mythic world like a storm no wisdom can completely turn aside. Ragnarök. The word has become so familiar in modern culture that it can lose its weight. It is printed on posters, used in games, attached to spectacle, made into a convenient synonym for apocalypse with better costumes. But in the mythic imagination, Ragnarök is not merely an explosion of noise at the end of time. It is the collapse of an order the gods have struggled to hold together. It is prophecy as pressure. It is the knowledge that even divine power has limits. That is what makes Odin's preparations so haunting. He knows, or at least has learned enough to fear, that a final conflict is coming. The gods will face enemies that cannot be permanently negotiated with, domesticated, or ignored. The worlds will be shaken. Old boundaries will fail. The powers of chaos, long delayed, will move openly. And Odin himself, for all his cunning and sacrifice, is not promised a clean triumph. This is the shadow behind Valhalla's brightness. The daily fighting of the Einherjar is not just an eternal sport. The feasting is not just indulgence. The whole arrangement begins to look like a reserve force kept in readiness for the day when the gods will need every blade they can gather. The chosen dead are not simply being rewarded for past courage. They are being conserved for future violence. In that light, Valhalla becomes almost practical, terribly practical. Odin is not collecting warriors because he has solved death. He is collecting them because he has not solved fate. He has taken the dead, the one resource war keeps producing, and turn them into a last defense against a catastrophe he cannot finally prevent. It is a brilliant idea, in the cold way Odin's ideas often are. It is also desperate. That desperation is easy to miss if we focus only on the grandeur of the hall. We see the shields, the benches, the warriors, the abundance. We hear the music later cultures have placed beneath the scene. But beneath all of it is a god counting losses before the final battle has even begun. Every chosen warrior is an honor, yes, but also a measure of fear. This gives Valhalla its deepest contradiction. It promises glory to the fallen, but it is built on divine anxiety. The warriors may imagine themselves elevated, and in the terms of the myth, they are. They have been selected, welcomed, fed, and armed in Odin's own dwelling. Yet their presence also reveals that the gods are not secure. A truly invulnerable god would not need an army of the dead. A god who controls destiny would not have to train casualties for a future he dreads. Odin's hall is magnificent because Odin is powerful. It is necessary because Odin is not powerful enough. That is a very different idea from a simple warrior paradise. It suggests a mythic universe where courage matters, but does not guarantee victory. Where preparation matters, but cannot cancel doom. Where even the highest gods must operate inside a fate larger than themselves. Valhalla is one answer to that condition, not a solution, an answer. Perhaps that is why the Einherjar continue to fight each day, not because the gods enjoy spectacle, or not only because of that, but because readiness must be maintained against a future that does not care how long one has been waiting. The warriors of Odin's hall are dead, but they are not finished. They have become a promise held in reserve. And what a strange promise it is, a promise that the best death is not peace, but continued usefulness. A promise that the fallen have not escaped history, but will be summoned into its most terrible moment. A promise that honor may survive the grave, only to march toward destruction with the gods themselves. Here, the emotional power of Valhalla becomes more complicated. For the living, it could soften grief. It could say that the dead warrior had not simply disappeared. He was with Odin. He was among the honored. He would stand with gods when the final hour came. That is a mighty consolation. But consolation is not the same as happiness. To be in Valhalla is to wait for Ragnarök. The laughter in the hall is real, but so is the shadow beyond it. Every feast occurs under a prophecy. Every morning's battle is a rehearsal for a battle that will not reset so easily. In the daily wars of the Einherjar, the fallen rise again by evening. At Ragnarök, the stakes are different. The myth does not offer a neat image of endless victory. That may be the most sobering part. Valhalla does not exist because the Norse gods are certain to win. It exists because they are preparing to lose well, or at least to resist with everything they can gather. Odin's project is not optimism in the simple sense. It is defiance, a refusal to meet doom empty-handed. This makes him less like a distant ruler and more like a commander who has read the last page and still orders the shields repaired. There is grandeur in that. There is also sadness. Because if even Odin cannot escape the ending, then Valhalla's glory is temporary by design. The hall is not outside fate. It stands inside fate, brightly lit, crowded with warriors, making ready. The dead are fed and honored not because history is over, but because the final demand has not yet arrived. So the great hall waits. Its warriors train, its benches fill, its lord watches the doors of the future. And somewhere beyond the daily rhythm of combat and feast, Ragnarök approaches, not as a surprise twist in the story, but as the reason the story has been moving all along. Chapter 10. The Warriors Who Were Not Chosen. Valhalla can become so bright in the imagination that it blinds us to everyone outside its doors. That is a problem, because if we only talk about Odin's Hall, we risk turning Norse afterlife belief into something much simpler than it was. We begin to imagine a world where every dead Viking warrior went to Valhalla. Every soul followed one heroic road, and the whole culture agreed on a single destination after death. That picture is tidy. It is also misleading. Valhalla was famous, but it was not universal. The Norse dead could be imagined in more than one place, and the surviving traditions do not always fit together neatly. Some dead are associated with hell, a realm whose name later became tangled in Christian ideas of hell, though the older Norse concept was not simply the same thing. Some traditions speak of the dead remaining connected to burial mounds, ancestors, land, or family memory. Others point toward different divine claims over the slain. One of the most important is folkvanger, associated with the goddess Freyja. In the surviving poetic tradition, Freyja receives a portion of those who die in battle, while Odin receives another. The detail is striking, but also difficult. It opens a door into a larger world of belief, then refuses to give us a full map. We are told enough to know Valhalla was not the only destination for the battle dead, but not enough to reconstruct every rule with confidence. That is where caution matters. Modern retellings often want systems. We like clean categories. Warriors here, ordinary people there, dishonorable people somewhere else. But mythic traditions rarely behave so politely. They overlap, they contradict, they preserve fragments from different places and times. A line in a poem may sit beside a story written down later, and the two may not agree in the way a modern theology would demand. So when we speak of Norse afterlife beliefs, we are not opening a single official manual. We are listening to echoes. Some are loud, like Valhalla. Some are partial. Some may have changed meaning as they passed through generations, and many were written down long after the period we most often call the Viking Age. The result is not useless, far from it. But it requires humility. The evidence can show us patterns and powerful images. It cannot always give us a complete chart of the dead. This changes the emotional meaning of Valhalla. If Valhalla was one fate among several, then being chosen for it becomes more dramatic, not less. It was not the default afterlife of a whole people. It was a special claim. To enter Odin's hall was to be separated from the larger population of the dead and drawn into a specific divine purpose. The chosen slain were not simply honored because they had died. They were honored because their deaths made them useful within Odin's design. But that leaves the others. The old man who died in bed after a hard life. The woman whose labor held a farm together through winter. The child whose name never entered a poem. The trader lost at sea. The enslaved person whose death left almost no trace in the record. The farmer killed in a feud, but not celebrated in song. Their worlds mattered too, even if the heroic sources speak of them less loudly. This is one of the quiet distortions created by surviving literature. What gets preserved is often what powerful people admired, performed, or wanted remembered. Warrior poetry loves warrior values. Elite stories preserve elite anxieties. A hall full of chosen fighters makes a better song than an ordinary death in an ordinary bed. But ordinary deaths were the majority of human experience. Valhalla's fame, then, may tell us as much about what was celebrated as about what was believed by everyone. That does not make the myth dishonest. It means the myth belonged especially to a world of status, violence, and reputation. It gave grandeur to a particular kind of death. It did not necessarily answer every grief. Hell, in the older Norse imagination, seems to have functioned as a destination for many of the dead, though the picture is complicated by later sources and by the influence of Christian vocabulary. It should not be flattened into a place of fiery punishment. The name can refer to a being, a place, and a broader idea of the realm of the dead, depending on context. What matters here is that not all roads led to Odin's benches. And then there is Folkvanger, the field or realm connected with Freyja. Its presence unsettles any overly simple claim that Odin owned the battle-slain entirely. If Freyja receives some of them, then the afterlife of warriors was divided in ways we only partly understand. Was this distinction based on cult, region, rank, gender, poetic tradition, or something else? The evidence is too thin to speak with certainty. But the existence of that alternative reminds us that Norse myth was not a single locked room. It was a house with many doors, some of them now only half visible. This matters because Valhalla has often been treated as the Norse afterlife, rather than one powerful afterlife image. The difference is not academic hair-splitting. It changes the moral atmosphere of the story. A universal heaven tells us what a whole world hopes for. A selective hall tells us what one part of that world honors, fears, and needs. Valhalla is not the whole landscape of death. It is the armed chamber within it. And perhaps that is why it dominates the imagination. It is dramatic. It is easy to picture. It flatters heroic identity. It gives death a sword, a seat, a cup, and a commander. Other afterlife ideas may be quieter, more domestic, more shadowed, or less fully preserved. They do not always compete well with the roar of Odin's hall, but the quieter dead remain important. Without them, we mistake the loudest myth for the whole belief system. We forget that Viking Age Scandinavia was not made only of raiders and kings, but also of households, craftspeople, farmers, traders, children, elders, enslaved people, and people whose names were never carved into fame. Their deaths, too, required meaning. Their communities, too, had rituals, hopes, fears, and memories. Valhalla answers one question with terrible elegance. What happens to the warrior chosen from battle? It does not answer everything. And that limitation is not a weakness. It is a clue. It tells us that the myth emerged from a world where death was socially interpreted, not merely biologically endured. How one died mattered. Who remembered mattered. Which god claimed the dead mattered. A person's fate after death could reflect the kind of life, the kind of status, and the kind of story attached to them. So we should let Valhalla remain magnificent without letting it swallow the entire Norse dead. Its doors are high, but they are not the only doors. Its benches are crowded, but not with everyone. Its glory is real within the myth, but its selectiveness is the point. Beyond Odin's hall, Other paths fade into mist. Burial earth, family memory, goddess-held fields, and realms whose meanings have not survived intact. The map is broken. The fragments do not always align. But the brokenness itself tells a truth. The Norse imagination of death was richer, stranger, and less uniform than the single shining word Valhalla suggests. And to understand why that one word became so powerful, we have to look beyond the mythic hall and into the world that needed it. Chapter 11. The world that needed Valhalla. A myth does not survive only because it is beautiful. It survives because it does work. Valhalla did work for the world that imagined it. It took the most frightening fact in a warrior's life, death in violence, and placed it inside a structure of meaning. It did not make the battlefield safe. It did something more culturally powerful. It made the battlefield interpretable. To understand that, we have to step away from Odin's hall for a moment and look at the human halls below it. The Viking Age was not one single society marching under one belief, one law, and one dream of death. Scandinavia was regionally varied, socially layered, and changing over time. People farmed, traded, crafted, negotiated, married, sailed, worshipped, feuded, and adapted. Some traveled far across Europe and beyond. Others lived lives that never resembled the rating image now attached to the word Viking. The evidence that survives is partial, and the picture is never as simple as modern legend wants it to be. Still, within elite warrior culture, certain values had enormous force. Reputation mattered. Courage mattered. Loyalty mattered. Generosity mattered. A leader's power was not just measured in land or weapons, but in the ability to attract followers and reward them. A warrior's worth was not only what he claimed for himself, but what others would say of him when the moment came. Honor lived in public memory. That is the soil in which Valhalla makes sense. A hall of chosen warriors under the greatest possible lord is not an arbitrary fantasy. It is a divine version of the social world that elite fighters already knew. In life, a warrior might seek a powerful patron, a place at the table, gifts for service, and a name that would outlast the body. In death, Valhalla offered the same pattern enlarged beyond human scale. Odin becomes the ultimate lord. The Einherjar become the ultimate war band. The feast becomes the ultimate reward. The battlefield becomes not the end of reputation, but its confirmation. This is why Valhalla should not be treated only as theology. It is also social imagination. It tells us what kind of death could be made honorable by story. It tells us how violence could be folded into identity. It tells us how a culture might turn fear into aspiration, especially for those expected to risk their lives in public conflict. A warrior who believed or hoped that death in battle could lead to Odin's hall might face danger differently. But even more importantly, the community around him could speak of his death differently. That may be the deeper function of the myth. The dead cannot explain themselves. The living explain them. A body comes home or does not. A name is spoken. A family grieves. Companions remember the last stand, the failed shield wall, the reckless charge, the loyalty that held too long. A myth like Valhalla gives language to that grief. It says the fallen did not merely lose. It says they were chosen. It turns bereavement into honor and honor into a form of endurance. But we should not romanticize this too quickly. The same myth that consoles can also pressure the living. If death in battle is glorious, then fear becomes shameful. If the hall of Odin waits for the chosen slain, then dying quietly may seem lesser in the stories men tell one another. Myths do not only comfort people, they can discipline them. They can teach a society what to admire, what to hide, and what to demand from those who wish to be remembered well. Valhalla, then, is not just a dream after death. It is a mirror held up before death. It tells the warrior what kind of ending might make his life meaningful in the eyes of his peers. It tells the young fighter that courage may be watched by gods. It tells the Lord that loyal men are part of a sacred pattern. It tells the poet that a violent death can be shaped into song. It tells the grieving that loss may be transformed into selection. There is beauty in that transformation. There is also danger. Because once violence becomes the path to glory, the imagination begins to polish the blade. The old myths do not need us to condemn them from a modern distance, but neither do they ask us to admire them blindly. They come from a world where survival, honor, and force were often bound together. To understand Valhalla honestly is to see both the emotional intelligence of the myth and the harsh culture it served. It made death bearable by making it useful, and usefulness was central to the warrior's place in society. The warrior served a lord. The lord gave gifts. The poet preserved fame. The hall made loyalty visible. In that system, the worst fate was not merely dying. It was dying without meaning, without recognition, without a story strong enough to carry the name forward. Valhalla answered that fear with a magnificent yes. Yes, the brave dead are seen. Yes, they are welcomed. Yes, they still belong. But the word warrior culture needs care. Not everyone in the Norse world lived by the ideals preserved in heroic poetry. Not every farmer wanted his son to die beautifully. Not every mother would have found comfort in the thought that Odin had taken what she loved. Not every community, region, or generation imagined the afterlife in identical terms. Some beliefs may have been local. Some may have shifted with contact, conversion, marriage, trade, and political change. The evidence does not permit one single, universal Viking mindset. That limitation is important. It keeps us from turning living people into costume pieces. The Norse world was not a stage filled only with hornless helmets, longships, and men eager for death. It was a complex human world, full of practical concerns and conflicting hopes. Valhalla belonged powerfully to one strand of that world, the strand that celebrated martial courage, public reputation, and a lord's hall as the center of honor. And perhaps that is why the myth has outlived the world that shaped it. It speaks to something broader than the Viking age. Many societies have tried to make death in war meaningful. They build monuments. They recite names. They create ceremonies, medals, songs, and stories. They promise that sacrifice will not be wasted. Valhalla is one of the most vivid versions of that old human labor, the attempt to rescue violent death from meaninglessness. But Valhalla does not only honor the fallen, it recruits them into a cosmic story. That is its special force. The warrior does not merely become remembered, he becomes necessary. His courage matters not only to his family, not only to his lord, not only to the poet who speaks his name, but to Odin and to the fate of the gods. The battlefield death of one man is woven into the final struggle of the universe. For a culture of honor, that is an astonishing elevation. For us, looking back, it is also a warning. The most powerful myths are rarely simple lies. They are meaningful stories built around real human needs. They touch grief, fear, loyalty, ambition, and the hunger to matter. That is why they endure. That is why they can move people long after the original world has vanished. Valhalla was needed because death needed meaning. But the meaning it offered came from a particular kind of world. A world of halls, gifts, oaths, blades, songs, and reputations balanced against the cold fact that no warrior could guarantee his next breath. And what we know of that world comes to us through sources that are themselves complicated, preserved, reshaped, and written down by hands that lived after the old religion had already begun to fade. Chapter 12. What the sources really say. The closer we look at Valhalla, the more important the sources become. Not because they ruin the mystery, but because they make it more interesting. A myth can feel ancient, whole, and immovable when it reaches us through modern retellings. It seems to arrive as one complete story, already polished by time. But when we ask where our knowledge actually comes from, the picture becomes less like a monument and more like a set of fragments laid carefully on a table. Some fragments are poetic, some are learned, some are late, some are difficult to interpret, and almost all of them passed through hands that were not living inside the old pagan world in the way the original storytellers had been. That matters. Much of what modern audiences know about Valhalla comes through medieval Icelandic sources, especially the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda. These works preserve material of enormous value. Without them, the Norse mythic world would be far dimmer to us. Odin, Thor, Loki, the Valkyries, Ragnarök, the halls of the gods. So much of that landscape survives because these texts were written down. But they were written down after the Viking Age, in a Christian context. That does not mean everything in them is false. It does mean we have to read carefully. The people who recorded these traditions were not modern anthropologists taking field notes in a pagan temple. They were medieval writers, poets, scholars, and preservers of inherited material. They lived in a world where Christianity had already reshaped intellectual life. Some may have preserved older myths with genuine interest and respect. Some may have organized them through learned frameworks. Some details may carry older memory. Others may reflect literary reshaping, misunderstanding, or reinterpretation. The evidence is precious. It is not transparent. This is where bad history often becomes too confident. It takes a scene from the Eddas, removes the uncertainty, adds a dramatic soundtrack, and speaks as though we have direct access to what every Viking believed around the year 900. That is not careful storytelling. It is costume drama pretending to be certainty. What we can say with more confidence is that Valhalla was a powerful mythic idea connected to Odin, the battle slain, and the coming crisis of Ragnarök. The surviving texts present Odin's hall as a place for chosen warriors, and they preserve the image of the Einherjar fighting and feasting under his authority. Those are not modern inventions, but the exact shape of belief around those images is harder to recover. Did every region understand Valhalla in the same way? Almost certainly not. Did all warriors expect to go there? The evidence does not support that kind of universal claim. Did people treat Valhalla as literal geography, poetic symbol, ritual hope, social ideal, or some mixture of these? Probably the answer changed depending on who was speaking, when, and why. That uncertainty should not disappoint us. It should make us more alert. Because myth is not preserved like a coin in a sealed box. It is preserved through performance, memory, politics, conversion, and writing. A poem may hold very old material, but the manuscript that preserves it may be much later. A medieval author may quote traditional lines while arranging them in a system that feels more orderly than living belief ever was. A story may be old in its bones and younger in its clothing. Valhalla comes to us through that kind of layered survival. The prose Edda, associated with Snorri Sturluson, is especially important, but also especially complicated. It offers explanations of Norse myth partly for the benefit of poets, preserving the mythological knowledge needed to understand traditional poetic language. That purpose matters. A handbook for poets is not the same thing as a sacred scripture. It can preserve old stories while also classifying, simplifying, and shaping them. The poetic Edda, by contrast, gives us mythic and heroic poems, often denser, stranger, and less neatly explained. Its poems can feel closer to an older oral world, but even there, caution is needed. Oral tradition changes. Poems are performed, adapted, remembered, and written down under circumstances we cannot fully reconstruct. So the responsible approach is not to throw up our hands and say, "We know nothing." We know some things. We know enough to see that Valhalla mattered. We know enough to see that it was not a generic heaven. We know enough to see its connection with Odin, the chosen slain, hall culture, warfare, and Ragnarök. We know enough to recognize that later fantasy versions often smooth out the roughness, but we do not know enough to erase every question. And that is where the myth breathes. The gaps are not empty. They are reminders of distance. Between us and the Viking Age stand centuries of change, conversion, manuscript culture, literary taste, political memory, translation, nationalism, romantic art, and modern entertainment. Each age has touched Valhalla and left fingerprints. Some fingerprints are obvious, others are harder to see. Even the word Viking can mislead us if we use it too casually. It can make a varied Scandinavian world sound like one occupation, one identity, one belief system. The sources themselves are uneven. They often preserve elite perspectives more clearly than everyday religion. They tell us more about gods, heroes, and kings than about the private hopes of unnamed farmers, women, children, enslaved people, and local communities. This does not make the sources useless. It makes them human. They survived because someone valued them, copied them, learned from them, and passed them on. They survived not as raw recordings of belief, but as literature. And literature can preserve truth in a form that requires interpretation. It can remember old images even while rearranging them. It can carry pre-Christian material through Christian pens. It can speak in symbols older than the page that holds them. So when we picture Valhalla, we should picture it with a slight edge of uncertainty. Not uncertainty that empties it of meaning, but uncertainty that prevents arrogance. The hall is there in the sources, but its roof is partly lost in the mist of transmission. The warriors are there, but the full range of beliefs about the dead is larger than the hall. Odin is there, but the way people understood him across time and place cannot be reduced to a single modern profile. This carefulness changes the mood of the story. Instead of treating Valhalla as a fantasy location we can tour, we begin to treat it as a surviving idea, an idea preserved in poems, interpreted by medieval writers, revived by later artists, and repeatedly reshaped by cultures that needed it to mean something new. The question is no longer simply, what did Valhalla look like? The better question is, what has each age wanted Valhalla to be? For medieval writers, it was part of inherited mythic knowledge. For poets, it belonged to a language of gods, battle, and heroic memory. For later artists, it became spectacle. For national movements, it could become a symbol. For modern fantasy, it became an aesthetic, an instantly recognizable world of axes, feasts, warriors, and doom. But underneath those layers, the older image still presses through. A hall, a god, the chosen dead, a future battle. That is why the sources matter so much. They do not just tell us what to believe about Valhalla. They teach us how carefully we have to listen. They remind us that ancient myths do not reach the present untouched. They arrive with cracks, translations, edits, silences, and survivals. And sometimes, the cracks are where the truth becomes visible. Because Valhalla is not only a myth from the Viking Age, it is also a myth about how the past itself survives. Incomplete, powerful, vulnerable to misuse, and still capable of gathering the imagination like warriors beneath a roof. Once the old hall entered writing, it could travel far beyond the world that first needed it, and in later hands, it would become many things the original storytellers could never have imagined. Chapter 13, The Myth After the Vikings. Valhalla did not die with the old religion. In some ways, its second life was even louder. Once the myths of Odin's hall moved into manuscripts, scholarship, poetry, art, and later popular culture, Valhalla began to drift away from the world that had first shaped it. The hall remained recognizable. Warriors, feasting, weapons, gods, doom, but each age rearranged the furniture. Some made it grander, some made it cleaner, some made it political, some made it entertaining. And often, the farther Valhalla traveled from its medieval sources, the more confident people became about what it supposedly meant. That is one of the strange habits of the past. Distance can create certainty. The medieval writers who preserved Norse myth were already looking back at a pre-Christian world from the other side of conversion. Later readers looked back through them. Then artists, composers, antiquarians, nationalists, fantasy writers, game designers, and filmmakers looked back through all of those layers. By the time Valhalla reached the modern imagination, it had become less a single mythic hall than a cultural mirror. People saw in it what they needed. For some, Valhalla became noble and tragic, a place where heroic courage stood against inevitable doom. For others, it became a symbol of northern identity, stripped of uncertainty and polished into something monumental. In romantic art and literature, the Norse gods could be made vast, stormy, and sublime, figures of wild nature, ancient freedom, and emotional intensity. Valhalla fit beautifully into that mood. It had grandeur. It had fatalism. It had the kind of dramatic architecture later painters and poets loved. But grandeur can be dangerous when it forgets its own construction. The Valhalla of later art is often more orderly and majestic than the surviving sources require. It can look like a palace of heroic destiny, all shining armor and clean lines. The unease remains, perhaps, but it is made theatrical. The raw questions fade slightly. Who is chosen? Who is excluded? Why does Odin need these dead? Is endless combat really a reward? These are less convenient than a strong visual image, and so the image often wins. Music gave the myth another kind of afterlife. The word Valhalla could become a sound before it was an idea, heavy, solemn, triumphant, filled with brass and thunder. On stage, the old gods could be transformed into figures of operatic destiny. Their world became larger than scholarship, larger than footnotes, larger even than the medieval texts that preserved them. This does not make the artistic Valhalla worthless. Art is allowed to transform, but transformation should not be mistaken for recovery. A painting can reveal a 19th-century dream while pretending to show an ancient belief. A fantasy game can make Valhalla feel playable while quietly rewriting its meaning. A film can give us the emotional truth of spectacle and still be historically thin. This is not a complaint. It is a clue. Valhalla survived because it is adaptable. It has a simple core that can be recognized quickly. Brave dead warriors in Odin's hall, feasting and fighting until the end of the world. That core is strong enough to carry many meanings. It can be heroic, tragic, militaristic, mystical, comic, frightening, or commercial. It can sell an album, title a video game, decorate a sports chant, or appear in a fantasy universe with very little explanation. The name itself does half the work. But popularity often makes myths narrower. The modern Valhalla is usually a reward for fighters. The older Valhalla is more complicated. A selective hall, tied to Odin's purposes, preserved through difficult sources, and shadowed by Ragnarök. Modern culture often keeps the reward and softens the use. It keeps the feast and forgets the recruitment. It keeps the glory and underplays the doom. That shift tells us something about modern desire. We still want death to mean something. We still want courage to be seen. We still want fallen warriors, or fallen heroes more broadly, to belong to a story larger than the moment of their death. Valhalla offers that in a form that is instantly dramatic. It does not whisper comfort. It raises a roof of shields and says, "The dead are not gone. They are assembled." No wonder later societies found it useful. National movements could turn Valhalla into a house of heroic ancestors. Military rhetoric could borrow its language of chosen sacrifice. Romantic artists could use it to escape the ordinary world into a grander, older North. Fantasy culture could transform it into an aesthetic of axes, ravens, runes, mead, and fatal courage. Popular entertainment could make it thrilling without asking viewers to sit too long with its darker implications. And in the worst hands, myths like Valhalla can be abused. Any myth that glorifies the warrior dead can be pulled into ideologies that want violence to look sacred, pure, or destined. That does not mean the myth itself belongs to those ideologies. It means powerful symbols require careful handling. Valhalla is not innocent just because it is ancient, and it is not guilty simply because later people misused it. It is a dangerous inheritance in the way many strong myths are, capable of consolation, beauty, and distortion. This is why returning to the sources matters, not to drain the myth of wonder, but to keep it honest. The older Valhalla is not a blank banner for whatever modern culture wants to write across it. It belongs to a specific mythic world, preserved through specific medieval texts, tied to specific ideas of warfare, divine selection, hall culture, and cosmic doom. When we remember that, the myth becomes richer, less useful as propaganda, less simple as fantasy, more human. It becomes a story about what societies do with death. The later afterlife of Valhalla also reveals how myths gain power by losing detail. Most people do not need to know the complexities of the poetic Edda or the prose Edda to feel the force of the word. They hear Valhalla and understand heroic death, northern gods, an honored hall. That speed gives the myth its modern strength, but it also leaves room for misunderstanding. A symbol that is easy to recognize is also easy to misuse. So when we see Valhalla in art, music, games, or nationalist imagery, the best question is not simply, is this accurate? Sometimes the answer is obviously no, and sometimes accuracy is not the artist's goal. The better question is, what does this version need Valhalla to do? Does it need the myth to comfort grief, to glorify violence, to create atmosphere, to sell adventure, to claim ancestry, to make death feel chosen? That question brings us back to the oldest function of the hall. Even after the Vikings, even after conversion, even after centuries of retelling, Valhalla remains a machine for meaning. It takes death in battle and turns it into belonging. It takes fear and gives it architecture. It takes the fallen and places them beneath a roof where their end becomes part of a larger design. The design changes from age to age. Odin's hall becomes a theater, a painting, a symbol, a game world, a song, a slogan, a dream. But somewhere inside all those versions, the same troubling promise remains alive. That violent death can be made glorious if the story around it is strong enough. And that may be the reason Valhalla never really left us. Not because we still live in the world that created it, but because we still understand the temptation. Chapter 14, The Dark Promise of Glory. Valhalla endures because it answers a fear that has never belonged only to the Norse world. The fear is not simply death. It is meaningless death. A person can face danger for many reasons: duty, loyalty, hunger, ambition, pressure, love, desperation, pride. But when the body falls and the noise of the living world moves on, one question remains for those left behind. What did it mean? Was it waste? Was it courage? Was it fate? Was it something a family could carry without being crushed by it? Valhalla gives a severe answer. It says the fallen warrior was not merely killed, he was chosen. That word is the emotional engine of the myth. Chosen, not lost in confusion, not erased by violence, not reduced to a body on cold ground. Seen, selected, claimed by Odin, given a seat among others whose deaths have also been turned into status. The terror of dying in battle is transformed into the honor of being wanted by a god. It is difficult to overstate how powerful that idea can be. Human beings are meaning-making creatures, especially around death. We build stories where silence would otherwise be unbearable. We speak names aloud. We carry tokens. We make ceremonies. We argue over memory. We place the dead into patterns larger than one heartbeat stopping. Valhalla belongs to that same human labor, but with a warrior's grammar. The dead are gathered, armed, fed, and prepared. This is why the myth can feel beautiful even when its logic is brutal. It does not tell the warrior that violence was meaningless. It tells him violence was the road to recognition. It does not tell the grieving that the dead have simply vanished. It tells them the dead have entered the company of Odin. It does not tell a culture to look away from the battlefield. It tells that culture to reinterpret the battlefield as a threshold. And thresholds are seductive. They make the unbearable feel like passage. They suggest that a moment of terror might secretly be a door. The dying warrior does not merely sink into the earth. He crosses into a hall. His final breath is not only an ending, it is an arrival being arranged from above. But the seduction has a cost. The same story that gives courage to the frightened can also make violence easier to praise. The same myth that comforts grief can teach people to admire the kind of death that produces grief in the first place. This is not a flaw unique to Valhalla. Many cultures have struggled with the tension between honoring sacrifice and glorifying the systems that demand it. The line is thin. Sometimes it is crossed quietly. Valhalla stands directly on that line. It dignifies the fallen, and it glorifies the condition that made them fall. It gives the warrior a future, but the future is still shaped by war. It offers brotherhood, but brotherhood inside a hall built for the final battle. It takes death out of meaninglessness, but not out of violence. That is the dark promise of glory. Glory can preserve a name. It can give courage a public form. It can help a community survive loss. Yet glory can also become hungry. It can ask for more bodies, more stories, more beautiful deaths to prove itself real. A culture that worships glory may find it difficult to admit the plain sadness of the field. The old Norse myth does not hide that sadness completely. Perhaps that is why it still feels honest. Valhalla is not a place of simple happiness. Its joy is shadowed by purpose. Its abundance is shadowed by obligation. Its honor is shadowed by the fact that Odin is not saving the warriors from war. He is keeping them for it. That makes the myth more mature than many modern versions of it. A simple fantasy says, "Die bravely and receive eternal reward." Valhalla says something sharper. Die in battle, be chosen, feast among the honored, fight again each day, and wait for the doom that even gods cannot escape. There is no childish comfort in that. There is comfort, yes, but it comes wrapped in fatalism. The warrior is elevated, not liberated, remembered, not released, celebrated, not healed into peace, and still we understand the appeal. To be chosen is to matter. To matter is one of the deepest human desires, not only to live, but to have one's life counted, not only to die, but to have one's death interpreted as part of something larger. Valhalla gives that desire a magnificent form. It says the fallen warrior has entered a story so large that even the end of the gods will require his presence. For people living close to violence, that kind of story could carry enormous emotional weight. It could help men face battle. It could help families speak of loss. It could help poets turn grief into memory. It could help rulers frame loyalty as sacred. It could make the world feel ordered when death proved it was not. But from where we stand now, the myth also asks us to be suspicious of beauty, not to reject it, not to mock it, to examine it. What does a beautiful story make easier to bear? What does it make easier to repeat? When death is given a golden hall, do we honor the dead, or do we begin to envy them? When violence is turned into a path toward divine recognition, who benefits from that belief? The warrior the grieving, the lord, the poet, the god waiting at the high seat? The answer may be all of them. That is why Valhalla is not easily dismissed. It is not merely propaganda, not merely comfort, not merely fantasy. It is a myth with many uses, some tender, some political, some frightening. It reveals a world that wanted to believe courage could outlast the body, and that the battlefield's cruelty could be folded into cosmic purpose. The dying warrior on the field becomes bearable only because the story refuses to leave him there. It lifts him, names him, seats him, feeds him, arms him, then it asks him to fight again. That final turn is what keeps the myth from becoming sentimental. Valhalla does not allow glory to rest as a decoration. Glory has work to do. It must prepare for Ragnarök. It must serve Odin's fear. It must turn memory into military strength. So the promise remains double. You will not be forgotten. You will not be free. In that double promise, the old hall still speaks with uncomfortable power. It tells us that human beings can endure almost anything if they believe it has meaning. It also warns us that meaning itself can become a weapon, and perhaps that is why Valhalla continues to fascinate long after the world that shaped it has passed into fragments. It is not simply a fantasy of death. It is a question disguised as a reward. What would you accept if it meant your death was not meaningless? Chapter 15, The Last Doors of Odin's Hall. Return, one last time, to the battlefield. The cold has settled low over the ground. The shouting has thinned. Somewhere men are still fighting, but for the warrior lying beneath the gray sky, the world has narrowed to breath, pain, and the weight of the weapon in his hand. This is where Valhalla begins. Not in the feast, not in the roaring hall, not in the later paintings, operas, games, and fantasies that turned Odin's dwelling into a bright emblem of heroic death. It begins here, at the edge of fear, where a violent ending needs to become something more than loss. The old myth answers with a door. For some of the battle slain, death was not imagined as disappearance. It was selection. A Valkyrie's choice, Odin's claim, a passage into the company of the Einherjar, where the dead would fight by day, feast by night, and wait beneath the roof of the god who gathered them. But after following the story this far, Valhalla no longer looks like a simple heaven. It is too armed for that. It is too purposeful. It offers honor, but not peace. It offers abundance, but not release. It offers brotherhood, but within the boundaries of a warband. The warrior's body is restored, but his role remains unchanged. He has escaped the finality of one battlefield only to enter the rhythm of another. That is what makes Valhalla so haunting. It does not comfort by saying violence was over. It comforts by saying violence had meaning, and meaning can be a powerful mercy. For the dead, it gives a story. For the living, it gives language for grief. For the warrior culture that imagined it, it turned courage, loyalty, and death in battle into something that could survive beyond the body. Yet the myth never lets us forget the cost. Odin does not gather the fallen only to honor them. He gathers them because Ragnarök waits. The hall is a reward, but also a reserve. The dead are celebrated, but also needed. They are chosen, but also claimed. So Valhalla stands in a strange place between glory and dread. Not paradise exactly, not prison exactly. A hall of preparation, a place where the dead are given everything a warrior might desire, except the one thing a modern soul might expect from heaven: rest. And perhaps that is why the myth still holds us. It understands the human hunger to believe that death can be made purposeful. It understands the terror of being forgotten. It understands the beauty and danger of stories that transform loss into honor. The evidence that survives is incomplete. The sources are layered, late, and shaped by the hands that preserved them. We cannot reconstruct every belief of every Norse community, and we should not pretend that Valhalla belonged to all the dead, or even to all imaginations in the same way. But the central image remains. A warrior falls, a god waits, a hall opens, and beyond its doors, there is warmth, noise, food, weapons, comrades, and the shadow of an ending. Even the gods cannot escape. That is the last truth of Odin's Hall. It does not erase death. It gives death a task. It does not promise eternal peace. It promises a place in the final muster. So when we speak of Valhalla, we should not picture heaven in the modern sense. We should picture a great hall lit against the dark, crowded with the chosen dead, alive with feast and combat, magnificent and uneasy. A place where glory never sleeps. A place where the fallen wait.